Hello, people. Boyo alert. We're here with a sage Boyo today. We're here with James. We're here with Skip Conover. Conover is correct?
Conover, yep.
Conover. Oh,
Yep.
Jesus, I got that wrong. And Stefan David Boyo here as well. And we are with a fellow Jungian and a true Jungian who has spent a long time reading Jung and has actually began a series on our famous Aion series before us. And he was one of our resources, one of the people we turned to when we wanted to get a little bit of knowledge, a way to contextualize this. So we thought we'd set up a meeting and have a deep discussion about this book coming from another perspective, because obviously it has really impacted everybody on our channel. The vast majority of people on our channel are here for there for me, and then obviously the Ion lectures as well, and not James. And
Yeah, I was
it's
going to say, where's me? Thank you very much.
the Ion lectures are fantastic, and we're going to dig into them today with Skip, get his angle on it, get his knowledge, and try to expand that out. So let's do some introductions. Let's check in how everybody's feeling. Skip, tell us what's up. How are you, sir?
Okay, well, let me do my intro now.
Oh
So,
yes.
so I was approached by Stefan about Jung, and I'm very impressed by the Überboyo channel for uh, really bringing a very energetic cut on Carl Jung and indicating a hope for the future generation. So I'm very happy to be here. James, if you could, you should be able to see a chat on your screen, and if you would put a link um, to your
Yep,
channel also, I'd appreciate that.
can do, can do. But yeah, but the people on Stefan's channel know me from the Ion lectures, as well as like a million other streams.
Yes, of course.
Okay, well,
My
just give
beautiful
me a
stuff.
stream. Okay, that's good. So
There we
so I
go.
can have that. All right. So Stefan, you wanted to ask questions. Let's go for what you want to ask, and
Well,
then we'll see what I talk about.
we'll go with the brief pitching and say, everybody who doesn't know me and James, we will link the Ion lecture one below. You can pop in and check it out. It's the best way to get to know us. We hammer into this book. We do have a very fresh, young perspective because we're idiots, so we have to break it down and make it really layman's. And for that reason, people like it. They're like, well, you can resonate with this. So definitely check it out. That is us. People who do not know Skip, we will link Skip's Ion lectures, and you can pop in there because he is a vastly deeper understanding of many of the higher contexts, such as certain ways that ion is framed in Greek and whatnot that we just don't have the knowledge for yet. And it's a fantastic resource to get that perspective on it, seeing how much what those words mean, and going really deep into it in that sense. And oh yes, Skip has read a lot more of Edward Edinger.
Edinger,
Edinger, yes, who
Edinger.
is who is like a very, very, very prestigious authority on Jung in this book in particular. So definitely check it out. We will link that as well, sir. If we were to begin anywhere, I guess we would. There's a few things I wanted to talk to you about, but I guess the most important thing to ask you would be what. Give us your story. What got you into Jung? Like, was it all that seeing all that war? You were just like, okay,
Well,
The name.
let's see. The first thing that got me into Jung was my anima, and do you know what anima is? Does it
oh
have?
yes, yes.
Oh yes, this is a good
Okay,
topic.
all right. So let me first of all share with you my anima so that you appreciate this. So I'm going to share my screen for a moment. Okay, here. This is my anima. Okay, and that's a photograph of my mother when she was 18. And mind you, I was
That's a
born.
photograph.
Yeah, and
Doesn't matter.
mind you, she was born, or I was born 2 years later. So the first woman that I ever saw was her. Okay, and so that's my anima. And every time I see a woman who has long brown hair like that, um, it my anima shouts at me, "That's the woman for you." Okay, that's what my anima does. Okay, and to the point where when I first started my group, uh, I had 5 psychotherapists show up in my group. Okay, they were all checking out whether I was poaching on the psychoanalytic community. And so I'm not a mental health professional. Like you, I'm a self-taught Jungian, and I want to communicate with laymen. So if anything I say that you don't follow, just let me know. But in any case, this is a longish story, but I'll try to make it short. So I was working in the University of Maryland Graduate School teaching finance, and one of my colleagues was a woman who had hair like that. Okay, and she was a brand new spanking PhD psychologist, and so
Spanking, you say, yes?
yeah, she sat down with me at lunch one day and started to ask me if I knew anything about the Myers-Briggs type indicator. And are you familiar with that?
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
Yes.
So I said no, and she said it was based on the work of Carl Jung. And so for whatever reason, you could imagine, she sat with me for lunch for 10 days and got me to finally grok the Myers-Briggs. And I studied that for a period of time. And also, I got into a business that I built on my own, and had a lot of ups and downs, which you have when you are building a business. And so one day I was just in a bookstore, and I picked up the hardbound version of Man and His Symbols. And over the next year, I read about 3 or 4 pages a night of it to my wife just before we went to sleep. I would read that book. And at the end of the year, I really felt like I'd had a year of psychotherapy. And so that kind of got me interested. And then there's a book called Women Who Run with the Wolves by...
yes, I know it. Yeah,
you
I
know
bought
it.
it from his sister.
And so Dr. Estes, who wrote that book and made a great success of it, one of the stories in it is called Vasilisa the Wise. And my mother gave the book to my wife for Christmas in about 1993. And I started to read it, and I said, "You can't have it. I'm going to read it." and so I'm reading Vasilisa the Wise, and I was thinking about writing a novel, and there's actually a story about this on video on my site, so I'm going to skip ahead to the good stuff. But in any case, what happens when you get involved with these archetypal issues is that you can start to have, archetypal dreams and visions. And so what happened to me, Estes in the book had given me the 9 steps of women's development of their intuition. Okay, women develop their intuition as a way to survive in the world. And so the 9 steps were there. So I said, okay, well, I want to write a novel about the first woman prime minister of Japan. And there's a long story why I wanted to, but in any case, I decided to use that Estes' story as a structure for my novel. And because I was writing about a woman and I don't know anything about being a woman, so I thought it makes sense to follow that schema, right? So I started to write it, and within 2 days I started to have visions. And the heroine of the novel, whose name is Meiko, she started to wake me up in the morning, a vision of her. And she was, in the vision, she was a 15-year-old beautiful Japanese woman in a kimono, and every morning she would wake me up and make me go to my computer. And I would sit down, put my hands on the keyboard.
May I briefly interrupt? What is a kimono?
Kimono is formal Japanese dress. Okay.
It's the kind of dress thing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, Mako Memoirs of a Woman. That's the name of the novel, and my pen name is David Garrettson.
Oh damn! You got a novel out as well.
Yeah. Okay. So you could find that on Amazon, but it's also available for free on my Dropbox, so you can just download it. But in any case, I would go and I would put my hands on the keyboard, turn my screen down as low as I possibly could so it wouldn't wake me up, so I could stay in kind of this dream state of first waking up, right? And I would start to write it, and the novel just wrote itself. I have no recollection of consciously doing it. I did it direct from my unconscious.
And so this was one of your main accesses, your main touching points with the actual Jungian stuff in practice? Because a lot of people read the theory, but they never actually do it. Was this you getting your hands dirty and actually experiencing it?
Well, it was right, and it was an act of imagination, and it lasted for 8 months. It took 8 months to write the novel, and so this visioning kept going for 8 months, but it, among other things, it contains some. If we are a nice company, we say erotic passages, but it really has some
spanking passages. Yes,
it has chapters which are pornographic. Okay, quite simply.
Oh, right.
So did you have pornographic visions when you were writing this then?
Yes, and
yes. So this would have been a situation of you getting in touch with the muse and it giving you a message, and you bring it forward. So you would have read Man and its Symbols. You would have got the gist, but then this happened to you. This brought it forward and made it tactile. And is that when you started turning on to Jung and being like, okay, what the hell? Did you try to interpret the novel per se?
Right, but then it scared the crap out of me, okay, because I had written this novel that was pornographic, and I was in the middle of my business career, and so I said to myself, what am I going to do with this? Can I have this out in my own name and have it be pornographic? And if you're familiar with Anne Rice's work, that was very popular at that time. And she never hesitated. She'd be on the Today Show saying, "Oh yeah, that was my pornography." The Taking of Sleeping Beauty and things like that she wrote before she got into vampires, right? But this was before she got into vampires. But in any case, I was in the middle of my business career, so I actually put that novel in my drawer for 21 years. And I promised myself that when I was 70, I would publish it, okay? And so I actually jumped the gun a little bit, but then I started to read other things about archetypes, including Jean Shinoda Boland's 2 books. One of them is Gods in Every Man and Goddesses in Every Woman. And those remind me very much of what you did about Alexander the Great a couple days ago, okay? Because she's going through the Greek myths, and she's talking about how these are still alive in us today. And, you were saying how you can find your inner God, let's say, and that's exactly what Jean Shinoda Boland was saying in the mid-90s in these 2 books and some of her other books, but those 2 books in particular are must-reads if you haven't read them. And so from that I learned that my God types are Hermes, which is Mercury, and Hermes is the god that would go into the underworld, namely the unconscious, and bring things up for other people to be aware of. So that's the job of Mercury, or Hermes. And the other is Hephaestus, which is Vulcan. Okay, and so Vulcan was a cripple who worked at his forge, um, and made things. And so my personality type is to want to make things, and so that's why I made the YouTube channel. So I'm taking stuff from the unconscious and I'm putting it up on the YouTube channel so people can see it. That's my Mercury side. And I'm constructing both the YouTube channel and the website called archetypeinaction.com. And I've been doing that since 2010. And in terms of self, that, I've had no choice about doing that. That's one of the things that myself has made me to do, although it's made me do three things simultaneously.
Okay. So it seems like it was pushing you down that artist creative world, which is interesting because I think Jung is, if we were to front any very basic principle, I think Jung is an excellent tool for any artist because he just makes you think in the way an artist should think. Oh, Jesus, that's a dodgy sentence, but you know what I'm saying. He has this very powerful way of understanding and even scientifically grounding the ideas of psychology that are very useful to artists and honorable to that way. And that's actually what brought me into it. I'll get into my story in a bit, but let's bounce over to James, because James has a very interesting anima story.
Go ahead. I'm interested in how you guys got into it.
Yes, he's just dying to hear. Go on.
Yeah,
James.
well, I got into Jung a while back just because I kind of liked Jung, to be completely honest with you. I had this weird connection to Jung, actually from the Myers-Briggs type. When I was young, I was interested in who I was, and Carl Jung seemed to be the guy who best articulated who you are. But I did very recently have a very strange vision, completely and utterly sober, completely and utterly drug-free, of what I can only describe later on as Athena, which is very, very weird to me because I wasn't familiar with Greek myths very much at all at that particular time. And I came home from I was like working myself to death basically, and I was struggling with some different addictions, and I finally broke, and I came home to my fiance, and I just sat there staring at the wall, crying my eyes out. And I'm a stoic man, like I'm like an uptight Englishman. I don't cry, and I was crying at the wall. And she was like, James, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And I was just sitting there, not talking to her, talking to this almost green lady. And this green lady there was telling me exactly what I was doing wrong. There were three specific things I was doing wrong in my life that I kind of knew already, but didn't really articulate it to myself. And what happened is this green lady, she sort of merged over and joined with my fiance, whose face became like an owl almost. So like she was a specific manifestation of the divine feminine and also an owl. So thinking about it later on, she's Athena from the Odyssey. It's the exact same thing. It's the hero's patron. Now she's named Athena because of Athens, and the symbol of Athens was the owl. So it all stacks up on top of each other. And I've realized that if I do what she told me to do, my life is wonderful. If I break it, my life starts falling to pieces. And through reading Jung, I realized that was some form of anima. It wasn't the lowest development form, something like Eve. It was something just a little bit higher than that. It wasn't quite Beatrice from Dante's Inferno either, which I would have liked it to be, some kind of redeemer.
Well, Athena is the goddess of wisdom, so...
Yes. It's like, I think it's slightly lower than, whatever the hierarchy of animas is, it's slightly lower than Beatrice. But that was my experience with that, and it's like, that's when I realized I just had a vision of a goddess. Like, this stuff is real, and I wasn't high, because I don't do that type of thing.
Right.
It's absolutely unbelievable to me.
Yes, it is a fascinating story. We most certainly can get into the anima in depth. Do you want me to run into my one?
Go ahead. Yeah, Stefan, I want to hear yours. Sure.
I will allow you to speak, Stefan.
Thank you, Jesus, James. Thank you. I was literally shaking in my boots there. My one began. Well, I guess it was me going to college, and I took LSD. So James avoided doing drugs. I unfortunately took drugs, and my first experience with LSD was very negative. I felt like I sort of I gave myself a mental disease, you could imagine, because I got this feeling that I lived in a cartoon. I got very, very sad and anxious all the time. It was a very, very negative experience altogether. Kids, don't do drugs. It's naughty for you. It's bad stuff. It screws with you. And so in order for me to deal with that, I started really getting into this idea of healing myself using dreams, because I was scared I was going to end up in a mental asylum. And I started lucid dreaming, and that at that point actually snapped me out of it a bit strangely. It was almost like I felt I had power again. And it took about 2-3 years for me to get this sense that I don't really live in a cartoon. And then I got in the straight and narrow. It became a juicy boyo. No problems then after that. It was just a weird little bump in the road from taking LSD. But it really ended when I decided that I would take LSD again on my own at a really, really high dose, which is kind of crazy, yes. Degenerate, utter degenerate behavior. And this is what I did. And I did it and I walked out among the fields and I saw like proper archetypical images, you could say. And like here's actually a picture of one. And this, you know, like stuff like this hanging.
Mm-hmm.
I was walking through a field and all the ground filled up with snakes, and then that face appeared in the sky, and then in another moment I saw the most typical personification of God you could ever imagine, like a man made of clouds in the sky reaching out and all that, all on drugs. Like, so I was like, wow, this is really, really intense. But after doing that, I came to this weird conclusion where it's like, don't do drugs anymore. You don't need to. I know I had read Jung and Nietzsche. I'd read a lot of Nietzsche at that point, but at that point I kind of sealed it off. I was like, all right, you've broken into that part of your mind, the unconscious, if you will. And it suddenly felt like there was this weird experience I had. It felt like I had been living in this sort of grayscale fake reality that I'd never actually been out of since childhood. And childhood was this kind of imaginative, dreamlike part of my life that I'd lost. Tragically, when you turn into a teenager, you lose that. And me taking that first LSD trip was actually me coming to consciousness of the fact that I had lost that. I didn't have the divine child within my soul. And then doing that again and woke it up, and suddenly I was drawing again. I was like, had amazing color abilities. I got back in touch with my artist. I'm very artistic. So that was that thing that came out of me. And then I was in college. I decided to drop out of college and read the Western canon. And my goal was to get the Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but I knew that in order to understand it, I'd have to contextualize it by reading Plato and all those guys. So I read all those guys, got up like sequentially to Zarathustra. I remember the day I was going to do it, I had Zarathustra. I climbed onto my fucking roof. I
did not hear this before. What the hell are you talking about?
I used to live on a roof apartment where you could open the window and climb out onto the roof.
Does a donkey mean anything to you?
Yes. It was very, very stupid. But back in these days, I did more of this stuff. And I had this mountain range in front of me, and I cracked open Thus Spoke Zarathustra and fucking read that book and cover to cover, and I was like, yes, this is class. And then after that, I was like, okay, what to do now? So so you're not going to like this, but I robbed Man and Its Symbols from my college and stole the book. And then I read that, and then I was like, oh, let's try Jung, because I'd always heard about Jung, but it was always this sort of not real way of hearing about Jung. And I'd read Nietzsche, and like nothing really had changed. It was like, oh, I read the prestigious book, but it was like, this was weird because the book is Thus Spoke Zarathustra almost had this like energy inside of it. I thought I was going to just find out something unbelievable. But then I read Man and Its Symbols, and Jung talked about the dream reading concept. And so of all things, I saw in Jung an actual, none of the other philosophers had this, an actual thing that you could do, like a practical thing. And I'm a very practical man, astoundingly. And so I was like, right, I'll try the dream reading thing. So for about 2 years, I just wrote down all my dreams. I got about a couple of hundred of them. I can't remember the exact count anyway. And recently I formed them into a novel, and that in essence was what you were describing with that experience with getting the anima to give you a novel. I had like pulled all those dreams out of this unconscious, and they shaped themselves into, you could say, the architecture of my own mind. It gave me something really insightful into my nature and human nature from that. And from there, I've always been able to, it's just been an amazing asset to me. I don't know how to describe it, but it was a complete Jungian process, I guess you could say. And after that, everything that Jung was talking about was just so much easier for me to understand because I'd done it. And I could almost like see things in a different way. And I've noticed that people just don't have this angle on stuff. It's not saying I know everything or like, you know, but it's almost like I know a part of myself that a lot of people miss nowadays, which is everybody's focusing on all the information on the internet, which is astounding, but they lose the information in themselves. And I guess Jung forced me to go in to look at that. And when I discovered that, I was like, holy fuck, I have a nature, and everybody has this nature. And if I learn this, I will understand everybody else. and it's just an amazing experience, I
Yeah.
guess. And
You
that was
have
that was sort of
no need to believe you know.
yes, it's something. Yeah, it's a weird experience, and I guess that's what got me into the guy and made me take him for real. Like I sort of think he's legit now. Like a lot of people, it's hard to believe sages and philosophers and gurus and all that. But I sort of, from doing what Jung said, I'm like, yeah, a lot of what he's saying is legit. And then this is where we lead to Aion. Like I started doing Aion with James, with this premise that what Jung is saying is legit, and then Jung's pretty much saying that, oh yeah, the Antichrist is coming. I was like, oh fuck, it was all good up until that point. So I guess that's my messy told story.
Yeah.
From there, we've got a lot bounced out. Where shall we go? Shall we go into the anima bit? Because I guess my story is more about talking about Aion. I'd like to talk about
Yeah,
that. But,
we can talk about Ion, and I set aside something for you here, which I'm going to share a screen for you. This is from Edinger's book, The Ion Lectures. Have you experienced that book? Do you have that book?
I've never read the book. James, have you?
Okay, so this is figure 5 from the Ion Lectures. And what this represents is the structure of the psyche. And I think this is very useful for anyone who wants to think about Jungian psychology at all. It's very useful to think about this because at the deepest point in the psyche, and Aion is all about the self and the archetype of the self, which is the very deepest archetype in the psyche. And so Jung calls this the self, but they also call it the God image, and they also call, Edinger has called it the greater personality in his lecture that I sent you the link to. And so in Jungian psychology, there are two centers. One is the self and one is the ego, but the ego is the smaller of the two, or, the less powerful of the two, because the self is the boss. And so the self looks out on the world through either the anima or the animus, and that's like a lens through which your self looks out on the world. And then the ego is your conscious mind, everything that's conscious in your mind. And so the self is unconscious, and we as human beings cannot distinguish between the self, which Jungian analysts can empirically demonstrate that the self exists in the clinical setting. Okay, so it's a provable fact. Okay, and
this is a very interesting topic about the empiricism, and
right.
I'll briefly drop in that something astounding I found recently was that the Bible, in the book of Genesis, and I think it's Genesis 6, if you take the names of the lineage from Adam all the way to Noah, it spells out a fecking sentence, and the sentence is, it basically says along these lines: humans, or man, who has been appointed mortal sorrow, the sorrow of mortality, the blessed God will come down. The blessed God will come down.
Right.
Proving, teaching that his death will lead to comfort, which is essentially the Christian story, which
right.
is so.
And have you read the Red Book?
I haven't read. I've read a bit of it, and I've kind of flickered through it, but it was so deep that in order for me to read it properly, I'd have to spend a couple of years at it, I feel.
Yeah, okay, but what you just said is very important because because the seventh sermon to the dead, which is the last thing in the Red Book, okay, and I read the 7 sermons of the dead on my channel, so you can find a playlist with the 7 sermons of the dead. The last sermon, where man is the gateway, okay, and here's what's significant about that, because the very last thing that Jung says in, let me see if I can find it here. Where is it? The very last thing that Jung says in um, in the Red Book and the Seven Sermons of the Dead is this. Okay, now this image is a picture taken by the Voyager spacecraft looking back at the Earth from beyond Saturn. And you and everything you ever heard of that has ever lived did it all on that, okay? And so the way the Red Book ends is that Christ tells Jung that he brought the beauty of suffering, okay? And my point here is that we don't get anything without suffering. Life is about suffering, okay? And suffering is a fundamental idea of human and all existence. And this is all we get. You are here, okay? And so, you know, you got to get over the suffering and get on with life, basically. I mean, people keep bitching about their suffering all the time, but that suffering is all there is, right?
Well, that's why Jesus was a symbol of the self, because that's the Christ story.
Like right. Okay. But what do you understand it to say? And I presume Stefan is a Catholic. Is that right, Stefan?
I wouldn't say I'm a Catholic, actually. No, I was a hardcore atheist for most of my life. Like Nietzsche has this ability to utterly deconstruct any sense of belief in religion or God at all. And only recently, since I've started doing the Aion lectures, I've started getting serious about the idea that the Christian God is not some phony idea, and it's not permissible to just dismiss it as easily as we have done. And as I like that diagram you put up of having the self regulating as the regulating center, what I found astounding about the Bible is that it seemed to have certain messages coded almost mimetically within it that people probably only discovered after the fact, that contains stories that almost seemed that they came from some separate. It's almost as like all these egos. You had all these Hebrews writing the Bible together. I think there was 44 writers, and it seems like over time this sort of collective self programmed something into the Bible through them, which seems like a God idea to me, which is it is
well,
God.
and Jung's point and Edinger's point is that you cannot distinguish the God image, which is empirically demonstrable. You cannot distinguish that from the metaphysical God.
Yes, and so this is what's astounding, is that it's a very based way of rationalizing that this stuff is legit. And when you describe your experience, and even like James's experience is very, very, James is even more crazy because he saw it. This idea of you getting in touch with, you could say the muse or an emotion, and it's eros, it's the anima, it's the muse, it's that energy, and then you write a novel out of it. This other one goes to James and says, pretty much gives him a self-help plan, and it's
yes, that's exactly right.
Well, these are all religious experiences, okay?
And so this is what I find crazy about it, is that you said that the anima for men is the portal to the self, the way the self sees the world. So it's almost like the self is somehow speaking through these experiences, almost using us or something like that. It's almost using us as a way to communicate.
It definitely is. I mean, we're just the players, like a Walkman or something like that. But there is something out there there's a spirit that is on its way. It's taking us somewhere, and it has. Jung's point throughout Aion and throughout all of his writing is that the spirit is taking the human being somewhere, okay? And at the very minimum, as far as we know, we're the only way that God is conscious of himself and his creation. And
And this plays into Aion in a very, very profound and powerful way. And I actually want to bounce on to James about this because his logical chops are just far superior to my rational Irish chops, sadly.
Logical boy,
Jimmy,
and you're a drunken boy.
Yes, it's too much alcohol generationally. I've just eroded our frontal cortex.
I'm being destroyed by the
James, tell us a little bit about this idea in Aion of, okay, so Skip has just articulated quite well that there seems like Jung seemed to come to this conclusive premise that there's a spirit that's leading us through our unconscious irrational emotions, if you will. And that is the self that I'm describing. The Hebrews seem to touch on when they wrote the Bible. It seems like it's a legit idea. Now, this is where it becomes fucking weird, is because if there's something speaking through us, where does this free will determinism thing come in? And this is where Aion gets scary, is because it's discussing almost like the character of the self. And Jung is suggesting that we're coming towards a conflict point where the Antichrist and Christ will start their tension. They'll start resolving the tension for what the self.
Well, that came long ago, Stefan. You're a little late on that one. Okay,
oh,
I mean the Antichrist came in about the 11th century and got heavily it was only at the end of the 19th century with Nietzsche that it was realized that God is dead, quote unquote, God is dead. Okay, so what was Jung's task? Jung, whose father was a Swiss Reformed pastor, and his 7 uncles were Swiss Reformed pastors, and who saw at age 11 had a vision of God defecating on the roof of the Cathedral of Basel and destroying it. That was his vision at age 11. And so Jung's task throughout his life, and one other thing, his father had lost his faith. And so his project throughout his life was to demonstrate that God lives, where he lives, and how he goes about doing the work of the Godhead. Okay, so he's the counterpoint to Nietzsche. Okay.
Yes, this is what I wanted to get James in on, is this idea of doing the work of the Godhead. And what I think James is very acutely aware of is that if we don't believe that there is a Godhead, we start to believe that our free will is all we have, and then there's all these conflicts going up. So Jimmy, any spins on some of those ideas?
It's the relations between the ego and the unconscious fundamentally. It's like, because your ego comes into development at some point. Mine was when I was 11, when I came off the school bus. I told the story in the Aion lectures. It was so weird. I'm like, I'm aware now. I suddenly exist. Like, very, very strange. But your ego has to contend with the unconscious figures, the shadow, anima in a man, animals in a woman, and the self. If you don't get that balance right, Jung warns against inflation. I actually think on a cultural level, we're dealing with pretty severe inflation of multiple kinds. It's like we think that the words that we say are our own when they're not. They're absolutely not. When everyone is almost possessed by, like, you know, the collective unconscious is in our own heads. It's evolved over a long time, but it's also kind of not at the same time. It's like they seem to interact with other people's collective unconsciouses in sort of a synergistic way. Very, very strange. And so people get possessed by these certain ideas. This is what happens when, like, Jung talked about it with people who did yoga, for example. It's like Eastern people who did yoga had great psychic hygiene and knew what they were doing. But then Western people who did yoga would be like, I am enlightened, I am God. There was actually just the self eating up the ego. It was that version of inflation. It's like, you're not a God, be quiet.
Right.
So it's like you need to strike that balance of
well, we all are children of God, and that's actually Christ's lesson. Okay, Christ said that he would send the Paraclete, right, the Holy Ghost, and the Holy Ghost lives in all of us, every human being, not only Christians, right? And so, but the problem is that can lead to inflation if you don't understand it and keep control of it. But remember Christ said, "Ye are gods." Okay, and Christ also said, "Heaven is spread upon the earth, and men do not see it." Okay, so that goes back to some key things. Okay, there's a man who wrote a book called Denial of Death. His name was Ernest Becker.
Yep.
And what we have to understand is death is nothing to be afraid of. Okay, and Becker's point and terror management theory is actually about trying to escape death. We could have a whole conversation about that, but here's the deal. When you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only difficult for your family. When you're stupid, it works the same way. Okay, and so what Edinger's point was in that lecture that I sent you, at the beginning of one of the lectures, he makes the point that the objective of Jungian analysis is to get you to the kind of religious experiences that the two of you have had. Okay, James had it naturally. Stefan had it assisted by drugs. The problem the problem with having it assisted by drugs is that we had 72,000 people die of opioid epidemic in the United States last year. And so, you really have to know what you're doing if you do it by drugs. And who else does it is Alcoholics Anonymous. Okay, and
well, this is an important point to bring out. That because sometimes when I say stuff like, yeah, I took a load of drugs and saw many faces of God and all that stuff, and it's not like that at all. That actually screwed me up for a long time, and it's not until I got clean and on the straight and narrow did that stuff start to make sense and contextualize properly. The part that I made the most advancing in, it's almost like I bust open a hole and then I have to reorganize all the chaos, and the true value came from when I got a job. So I'd just been broken up with my girlfriend. So I just got dumped. So I was in a bad place there. I had this injury. I was in a bad place there as well. I was literally on rock bottom. Right. And I got a job. I went out and started talking to girls, and I went to the gym and all this, and I was doing all these really basic, not focusing on the metaphysics or magic and all that stuff. I was getting really grounded and down to earth. And during that time, I spent my spare time working on the dream story, trying to put them together and all that. Honest to God, the amount of that was literally 7 PhDs worthy of understanding that I found out of that stuff. It was absolutely amazing. And that was all sober, doing the straight and narrow thing completely. So there is that thing. I just wanted a disclaimer to put in there that it's not like I do think that if you're popping out.
Anyway, you have to have that experience. Okay, and so Jung is asked in the BBC interview, do you now believe in God? And he said, very difficult to explain. I have no need to believe. I know. Yeah. And so when I saw that, I had an epiphany, because I said, aha, I know. And so then I said, okay, what do I know? That's the problem. What do you know? Okay, so what you know is that there is something that is driving us, okay? And you can't tell me what you're going to say 2 minutes from now. And Jimmy can't tell me what he's going to say 2 minutes from now, okay? Because we don't control it at the ego level. It comes out from the self, okay? And so the first thing to be conscious of is to be aware when a religious experience takes place. And so when I started to do my channel, I started to have religious experiences that I could record. I have 2 of them in video form, and I'm just going to share with you one that I have in still image form. And so there's a day that I was extremely alienated. Okay, so there's this dichotomy between inflation and alienation in the human psyche. And we have to go down the middle of that. That's Scylla and Charybdis, right? Mm-hmm. And so on this particular day, and we may get into it at some future date, but not today, I was extremely depressed, okay? And it so happens that I live 2 miles from the U.S. Naval Academy, and so I have a habit of going into the Naval Academy chapel and just sitting quietly, and I had a religious experience there, which I caught on video, or I caught on photographs, because I know about these things. So I said, holy shit, this is happening, and look at what it is. And so here's the experience I had. So I'm sitting in the chapel. It's quite dark in the chapel early in the morning. No lights were on, and suddenly only I lit up, okay? So I had this image of, only light coming on me. And I said, people are just not going to believe this. And so I turned the iPhone around, and then I took this picture. And you can see that even though I was very depressed and alienated, my entire demeanor changed, okay?
Yeah, happy boy.
Yeah.
That's crazy. The entire room is fucking dark. Like,
right. And
Jesus,
the light is
wild.
The light is only on me, and so this is a religious experience.
What time of the day was that?
It was at 10:30 in the morning.
What? So that's like middle of the day. Like, what? That is so mad.
And so
God was like, pull out your iPhone there.
Right. And, yeah, I mean, he was telling me something, right? Okay. And except I'm not a believer in a puppeteer, okay? This was a random coincidence. I acknowledge it, but it happened as a random coincidence at the exact moment I needed it, and there was a hook in my psyche to grab it, okay? And so therefore I grabbed it, okay? And just for your information, the image of Christ there is a Tiffany window that's in that chapel. And just to appreciate the art here, the Tiffany window is above, and the windows below, the 3 windows across the bottom, are not by Tiffany, and you can really see the qualitative difference just in stained glass windows. That's just an aside, but anyway. So the significant thing is to understand what God, first of all, what God is, okay? And so have you run across Jung's definition of God?
Jimmy?
The definition of God. I didn't know he actually talked about God. I thought he talked about the God image. Eastern stuff I've
Well,
read.
he did, but he was asked specifically, what is your definition of God? Okay. In an interview which took place with the Good Housekeeping magazine, believe it or not, very late in his life. It was only months before he died. And so his answer was this: God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse. Okay.
Oh, that's a really interesting idea, because
Right.
it's sort of what I was trying to drag out of James there earlier, is that we're coming across this tension in Aion, where you have this idea of that Nietzsche taught me, that we as humans need to create the Übermensch. It's the Luciferian thing. We need to create the Übermensch. We need to do it. We need to have a plan, and we need to will it into existence. And it's a very attractive and masculine frame. And it's that idea, it's premised on that idea of free will. But then within the context of a lot of this work, there is the suggestion that we don't have free will the way we think of it. It's almost like we are fed by some type of spirit. And what's
Well, and
crazy about this,
further, we cannot create the Übermensch. I mean, the Übermensch was created. That's what ultimately Adolf Hitler was. Okay, and he launched a psychic epidemic. Okay, it was literally a psychic epidemic. World War II was, and it was happening in other parts of the world too, obviously in Japan as well. But the Japanese were a bit behind psychologically in their development as compared to Western Europe. But Nietzsche put this idea of the Übermensch into the psyche of the Germans, and so the result was that by the time World War I came around, there were a lot of Germans that believed it, and then when they were destroyed entirely, then Jung could see by 1919, by people coming into his clinic, that World War II was going to come. He knew it would come.
yeah, that was an astounding thing. Where the way he describes, like it happened to him with World War One. He was on the train and saw blood flow across the like a couple of like a tidal wave across, and he was like, "What is this?" But then when World War II was coming around, he was like, "Yeah, I could see that coming, guys." Which is
Right,
cool. Like if any of you are marketers out there, you
right,
should study something, you get better predicting stuff.
right. And those visions that he had before World War One, which are described in the Red Book, are how he discovered the collective unconscious, what you're talking about. Okay, the fact that we share a psyche
Wow.
that involves all of us. Okay, and so
And so, what would your frame? Because this is something I've noticed James get really interested in. Is every time, the last couple of Ion lectures we've been Jung's been warning about ego inflation, and you have a very specific take on that. So, yeah, maybe James, could you predicate it on your spin? Because you seem to like think like every time we cross over like a sentence in one of our sentence long videos that says ego inflation, you're like, yes, let's talk about this.
Well, yeah, ego inflation is great fun because I have, I'd say, several friends who are very much into the occult, and they think that they're playing with, they think that they're talking with gods and playing with gods, and the things that they go ahead and do as a result of their rituals is their own conscious choice, but it's not. So the ego inflation I'm most interested in is when the ego is assimilated by the self, so the self takes over, and it's like you basically sink into a dreamlike state, and you under the illusion that the things that you're doing are your own conscious choice, but they're not. It's the interesting when you said that Jung's definition was something violently crosses my path and changes my life. You could include the shadow, the anima, the animus, or the self in that. So it's like the whole pantheon of gods across religions. There's like any one of them could violently take over you in this particular instance. So yeah, that's the definition of ego inflation. I think many people are suffering with this on a cultural level when it comes to people like Donald Trump and their immediate their mindset and their view of looking at the world.
right. But most of us get our bubble punched. Okay, I mean, I've been through several iterations of inflation in my time, and what happens is to most average people, or I mean normal people, people that aren't out there like our president, but for most of us, we get our bubble burst. Okay, the inflation gets burst, and then we go to the alienation and the depression. That's when people go run for the drugs, right? And so we have to live our lives down this middle path between inflation on one side and alienation on the other. And the best way to achieve that is by doing something, by whatever it is, by being a parent, by being an artist, by being a businessman that's building a company. Then you have the two streams that are coming along, and one says, you're nothing, and the other says you're the greatest thing that ever lived, right? But if you're building on something, whether it's a relationship with your girlfriend or a business or painting a picture, when you're doing that, it tends to be self-regulating. The problem is when people go over too far to one side, then they lose control. Okay, and this is what I was saying to you yesterday about Florence Foster Jenkins as a sort of a precursor to Donald Trump. Okay, because her problem and his problem is that not enough people said no to him along the way. And so the result was that he did not pass through what Jung and Edinger call the Job archetype enough times, okay? And this is something that you really want to do, okay? So the Job archetype, what is that? It is contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth, okay? So a Jungian analyst, if you go to a Jungian analyst, they don't want to see you unless you've had a defeat, okay? And they're not interested in you unless you've had a defeat, okay? Because only then can they get you to be reborn into something new, okay? And as long as you're not defeated, then you're going to keep going. So these people who never have no said to them, they just go puff, 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 up, and then they end up in a place they shouldn't be. Okay, mm-hmm. So in the case of Florence Foster Jenkins, she ended up at Carnegie Hall, okay, singing opera at Carnegie Hall, and when she saw the reviews of that, she died, okay, because it just crushed her ego, okay, it just crushed her, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens to Donald Trump, because I don't think there's anybody, regardless of which position you have with regard to him from a political point of view, doesn't matter. We're going to see what happens when his bubble gets punctured, and it's starting to happen.
I will say something about, briefly touch on that, about the artistic process. Like, as someone who's making music, just making anything really, but especially something that I turn into a sacred cow. Like, I actually put in serious work about, say, making a song or something, and I will spend a long time doing it, and I will like build it up in my head a lot. And oftentimes you can get attached to it emotionally. Mm-hmm. And one of the best things for you is actually just putting it out in the world and allowing it to fail, because that like frees you up. I remember I have like a load of music I haven't released, and I spent a couple of months trying to make it and trying to shape it and to be perfect. And I just could never allow myself to put it out there because I didn't think it was good enough. Mm-hmm. And so what happened was I started to get this sort of inflation in my head that I would think everybody else's music is shit and my music's the only good stuff. Yet I was afraid of putting it out there because I didn't think it was good enough. Right. And so the only way for me to overcome that was for me to actually just put a song out there. And even if it was shit, just like put it out there and allow myself to say, okay, it's out there now. It's going to fail. It's going to die. And when you don't do that, you don't expose yourself to getting that rejection. And then right. You can't ever move on. You can't actually tactilely improve. And then when you do that and you put it out there, you accept the failure, you take the negative emotions, you get over it, and you start to move on up. You start to
so the secret is to go through that cycle, okay, as many times as possible. Okay, it's not a question of avoiding that cycle. It's a question of going through the cycle as many times as possible. Because even every time, it's whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well, every time you go through that defeat cycle and survive and lament and are reborn into the next thing, whatever it is, every time you do that, you make your ego stronger. And you have to have a strong ego in order to survive the slings and arrows of life, no matter what, and yes. Of course, I know nothing about your music. I've never heard it at all, but your music is going to be better the more times you fail with it, okay?
Yes, it's true.
As long as you stick with it, as long as you stick with it, because if you lament and then you're reborn into becoming a Catholic priest, it's not going to help you very much. Your music is then gone, right?
I could get into Gregorian chants.
That would be good. Can I ask a quick question on this? Because I've always been interested. How strong do you think Carl Jung's ego was, and how far along the individuation process do you think Jung actually went?
Oh, he was way far beyond almost anyone.
Do you think he was fully able to integrate the self, if that's even possible?
Yes. Let me just read you something. I actually have it. In fact, I think I might be able to show you on. I think I can put it on the screen for you.
If that's the hypothesis, then he may have joined.
I mean, here's the answer for you, but I have to find it. I have to pull it up on my screen. So just give me a second.
That's fine. You always get interested in like how far along the Great Master went. You know.
No, this came up in our Aion lecture, actually, in our Aion seminar. So let me pull it up. Okay, so where did it go?
I know Stefan's managed to integrate the self. He told me the other day.
I literally am the self. That's
the definition of ego inflation.
I shed my previous vessel, which was Stefan, and I'm now just Boyo, self Boyo.
Okay, all right. Here it's going to come up, I think. Where did it go?
Donald Boyo.
Yeah, just a second. This is fighting with the technology here. Here it is. Okay.
We'll probably have to bounce after this, sir, as well.
So every basic analysis begins with the hypothesis of an analysand's wholeness.
This hypothesis is justified again and again, so that the analyst
learns that he can trust it. Each dream is a fact, an expression of this wholeness, and slowly one pours in the aqua of self-knowledge. The end result of the goal is the vas, or the wholeness, being filled with consciousness. The vena ardens could be called intensified spiritual life. The more unconscious people are, the more dull and boring their effect. But the nearer to individuation they come, the more exciting and wine-like their effect. One saw that marvelously with Jung. Just to be near him was life-giving, and practically everybody who knew him recognized that fact. It really follows the idea of the logion, which Jung himself quoted so often: "Man, if indeed thou knowest what thou doest, thou art blessed, but if thou knowest not, thou art cursed and a transgressor of the law."
Well, look at the citation. It says James 1924.
There you go. That was me back in
right. Okay, so that comes from this book, which is Barbara Hanna and Marie-Louise von France's book about lectures on Aion. Yeah.
Louise von France is very famous, yeah. People did often say that about Jung, is that he was an incredibly, I guess based is the best word I can use, that when he'd be around people, he was just, as you'd imagine, there's often this archetype of a psychologist who has like no psychological internal skill at all. He was like profoundly the opposite. He was very, very well matured wine version of a human spirit, that type of character.
Right.
And yes, I'm sure Jung was. He's a man I'd love to have just sit down and chat with in his German Scouser accent. That would be unbelievable.
Right.
Him and Nietzsche together would be fantastic.
Okay, so I don't know whether I've helped you here.
Well, it's been interesting, like especially the ideas about God and the will of God. That's a really important thing that we're hitting on now with these Aion lectures, is that we really need to get more clarity about the context of which Jung is talking about a spirit which reaches in and controls history. through our psychology of sorts. It's just something we really have to discover. But
Right.
yeah,
What I would urge you to do is find out about the way of what is to come. Okay, because it's it's bloody awful, actually. Okay, but
the way of what is to come
the
is that.
way of what is to come. In other words, God's way of making things happen. Okay, and God doesn't do it by making it so you can write a hit song. It doesn't work that way. Okay.
What?
God does it in a bloody, awful kind of way, okay? And so, what I would recommend to you is take a look on my YouTube channel at, I think it's the second horizontal down. There's a playlist called Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching
Oh,
for
yes.
Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, okay? And there's actually going to be, now I understand, a 4-volume series. The first 2 volumes are published, but the first essay in that series is by a non-Jungian analyst, but a Jungian named Thomas Arst, who's actually a physicist. Okay, and so because, and I read his essay into the channel so that you can hear it on the channel. Okay, so the first 2 videos on that playlist are his essay, his first essay. The the series has 50 Jungian analysts writing their essay about the Red Book. Now, keep in mind, the Red Book is Dr. Jung's visioning period, his active imagination visioning period. So when you read it, you can't read it like a novel, or maybe you can read it like a novel, but you can't read it like it's a psychology textbook. It's not. It's his actual experience, something like both of you described. Stefan, just like your drug-induced experience, James, just like your Athena experience. This was his experience, but he knew what was going on because he was a psychiatrist already, and he kept it going for 5 years. Okay, the experience I had, which lasted 8 months, his lasted 5 years. And so the Red Book was published in 2009, and I had kept my novel completely secret up until then, because I said, my God, what have I written? And then when I read the Red Book, I said, oh my God, this is what happened to Jung too. And so then I started to understand how all these things came together. Even though I'd been reading on Jung for, at that time, 23 years, but that really pulled it together for me. And so read that essay by Thomas Arst and focus on the way of what is to come, okay? Because that is a very critical aspect of what we're talking about. And it also is a subtitle in the Red Book. And so as much as I appreciate you guys and how you dove into Aion, which is a very difficult text, and many people bounce off of it. I think you need to go back and take a look at the Red Book and look especially at those 2 volumes called Jung's Red Book for Our Time, and see what the analysts themselves are saying about it, because they each have a different take. So it's like the Red Book is this uncut diamond, and each one of them has sliced off a facet and exposed it, and so it becomes so, number one, strong, but also brilliant when you read it from all these different points of view, and it really, really opens your eyes. And so that's a good thing to do. In fact, I would do that before you read the Red Book itself, and then at some point you'll say, "Oh my God, I've got to go back and read the Red Book now." Um, but
Beautiful, beautiful.
but
All right.
what I want to very highly say about you guys is I really respect what you're doing and the fact that you've dove into it. You dove into it, and so keep that energy up
Yeah.
because it's for your generation. You know, my generation is almost done. Okay. And you know,
Jesus.
and I'll
Not,
be
not yet.
glad. I'll be glad to help support your project as long as I'm
Beautiful.
able to do it. But I think that you're
Just
onto
send us some
something.
napalm.
Pardon?
Just send us napalm. That's all we
Well,
need.
we can talk about some other things too, but I think
Oh,
that,
can we? The napalm, yes, all right.
yeah,
Yes, most certainly, Skip. We would love to collaborate more. It's fantastic to have you on board. It's fantastic to have you as a knowledge resource out there to get as we said, the context that we need. We do definitely bring the energy, but the sages always bring the context, and it's the archetypes that we're possessing. We are the boyos, and you are the sage. So
yeah. So
that's
I'll be following your website as I can. I have my own projects, so
yeah, fair.
I'm not going to be able to keep up with everything that you do, but I'm certainly following it now, and I hope that you keep it going. And if there's anything you specifically want me to comment on, please send me an email. And by the way, you're not in our advanced reading group, right?
Is that in on Facebook?
No, it's in Dropbox. And what I have done is I've run what, as of tomorrow, will be a 32 session seminar on Ion.
Okay.
Okay, for the last 8 months. So there's about 60 hours of video, and we took it from cover to cover. Okay, we
Oh,
totally
that's what we're doing.
we totally stripped it down to the essentials, and a week from tomorrow we're going to start with Mysterium Conjunctionis, which is Jung's hardest book, and I'm specifically doing this at 1:30 p.m. on Wednesdays to allow Europeans to participate live in that seminar. It's also on Zoom, as we're doing here. And so if that would interest you or any of your listeners, I'm only asking for a $10 a month sponsorship for participating in the advanced reading group.
Is that
And
via Patreon?
well, you can do it through Patreon, or you can do it through PayPal, or there are
Okay, cool.
any number of ways of doing it. But
If anyone's interested, Skip, drop the link in the chat, and we'll stick it in the description.
Yes, that's a very good idea.
And
okay.
speaking of, we talked about boyos and sages. James has now updated himself to a sage because he released his first book today. James, please tell us about this book.
Yes, I
Oh
wrote my
yeah.
first book. I am an author. It's not on Carl Jung, sadly. It's more. So I like to consider. I like to consider religious thinking to be on multiple resolutions. You've got sort of self-improvement on sort of the top resolution. You have
Hmm.
more philosophical stuff. Then you got religion, and Carl Jung, I guess, was like sort of transcended this in many ways. That's why he's the great master. But this focuses more on the top resolution. It's all about developing a particular system to get you through life, almost so you can get yourself onto autopilot, properly manage motivation, dealing with failure, how to structure your day most efficiently as possible. Because I know there are lots of people who follow me in particular who are young guys, and they struggle with all of these different things because they're not taught how to. So
Right.
I decided to write a book along with two of my other friends, and it's over 200 pages long. And you can probably imagine we'll put the link to that down in the description down below. But
Okay.
it should be very useful to people.
Yeah, if you could put it on the chat, also the link to it. Have you got it on Amazon yet, or whatever?
It's on Gumroad at the moment, so it's an ebook.
Okay, it's an ebook. That's terrific. And I think that you guys are on the right track. I mean, there's a lot of people selling self-help, as you know. Our Barnes and Noble here has a shelf on both sides about 40 feet long, filled with self-help books. But most of them do not penetrate. Okay, that's the reality. I mean, you can read this stuff until you're blue in the face, and until you make a penetration to the deep unconscious, to the self, nothing else is going to really help. It just keeps washing off people. So,
Yeah.
so I haven't really monetized my activity here, but I respect you guys that you're going to find a way to do it, and so I keep doing it.
Skip, thank you very much for your time. It was excellent. I most certainly learned something today. I'm going to look into this, the will of God acting through us more, and hopefully His light will shine on me as well.
Yeah, actually, that definition is in the footnotes to Encounters with the Self, which is a book by Edward Edinger, where he's describing the William Blake etchings of the Job story, and I've read that entire book into the YouTube channel, which you can find on the front page. And so that definition is in that book. And Jimmy, as you were saying, God was an Englishman, that may be where it came from, because I think you probably know that the hymn Jerusalem,
Yes.
are you aware that the hymn Jerusalem comes from a poem by William Blake?
Absolutely.
Right, and he certainly gave that indication that Christ and God were Englishmen.
Yes, because it's probably true. I'm trying to get into his prophetic books at some point very soon, because William Blake seems like another one of those characters you've got to crack open.
I'm pretty sure I'm going to burn everything he owns before you get that, so there won't be any Blake left in the world. Actually, here's a fun fact. So when I was on that LSD trip and I came home, and I went up and I have Blake's illuminated works, so his original carvings in this huge book, cost me like 50, I think it might have been €80, and I cracked it open on a random page, and the poem that came up was "Little Boy Lost."
Oh my god.
It's so crazy, isn't it? I love Blake. I think Blake's fantastic. He's a terrible problem, though. It's probably irredeemable, and that's the fact that he's English. But other than that, he's unbelievable. He used to have amazing experiences. He said that he used to walk home and see angels filling up trees, and he'd tell his father about it, and his father would smack him and be like, "Don't be saying that crazy stuff."
Yeah.
He was very
So
interesting.
another thing we need to talk about at some point is synchronicity. That would.
Oh yes, please. I've got some stories on that too.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'll let you gents go, but thank you for a good conversation. And if you have
Thank you for
any,
your time.
if you have any need for this video from me, I'll be happy to make it available to you. But hopefully it recorded on your end.
I assume it won't. I don't know. Is it worked out here at all? Please send it on if you could. We'll probably chop it up and make it into maybe a few smaller videos of some sort.
Okay. So what I will do then, Stefan, since I have your email address, is I will create a Dropbox only for you and me. Okay. And it will take a couple of hours for it to crunch, and then I'll move the video over into that Dropbox, so you can then download it, or you can.
How about we use the Boyo Alert Dropbox email? Because me and James share an email.
Okay, and so what is the email?
Boyo Alert, BOYO.
BOYO alert.
Alert. ALERT.
ALERT
at gmail.com.
at Gmail. Okay, boyoalert.com. Boyoalert at gmail.com. Okay.
I
Yes.
believe that's it. Yes. Okay. Beautiful, Skip. Thank you very much, sir.
All right.
Yes, thank you. Massively appreciated, sir.
Okay, my pleasure. I enjoyed our conversation. Take care.
Beautiful.
Now, I am going to put this on my website also, so...
Beautiful. That'd be great.
I may edit out some of the first junk that wasn't meaningful, but
Yes, yes. We'll probably chop it up a little bit as well because it was quite freeform. But other than that, thank you very much.
Yep.
Is there a Facebook group? I believe there's a Carl Jung Depth Psychology Facebook group.
Right. That's run by my friend Louis LaFontaine. And
Oh, so that's not you, no?
no, that's not me. But what is me is Jung for Laymen. Is the that's one page I manage, and then there's a group called Jung Collected Works for Beginners or something like that. I run that page as well.
Is there any of those Facebook groups or Facebook pages? This is just a small request that you know of that we could perhaps prepare a pitch of some sort to put
Sure.
in the Aion lecture, number one.
Sure.
That'd be fantastic. Just
Yeah.
get the exposure.
Yeah.
And we would offer you if we had anything, but we don't. I guess we've got a Twitter, so we'll post something of yours up on Twitter, or if you
Right.
upload videos.
What is your Twitter ID?
Mine is Stefan StefanFox that's at Stefan Fox.
Okay,
Your Twitter name,
STAFAN
At
FOX.
Yes, at STEIFANFOX, capital F.
Okay,
Why are you saying it like a child, Stefan? E-A-A-O-O.
yeah,
E-A-F-A-N.
could you just for us people who have poor hearing, just put it on the chat for me?
Yeah, that's probably a better idea.
Both of your Twitter accounts, because I do use Twitter very often.
I'll get old Jimothy over there. Wait till
Yeah, and mine is just skip_Conover. Okay.
You really. Actually sent the links.
Okay, terrific. I'll put some things together for you, and we'll be in touch.
Beautiful, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Pleasure chatting with you today.
Sweet.
See you later, Skip. Have a good one.
All right, take care now.